Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Today I'm getting all of my rods and reels ready for the season. As far as the rods go, I just put them in my rod organizer that I just built the other day. So those are done, but the reels, I go through them with a fine-tooth comb. And I just got a shipment of new rods and reels from Fishing. Got a bunch of VLD 10s in the mail, some Stunner spinning reels. And so since I was working on these reels, and actually the only thing that I was really doing with the new ones, just so you guys know, it's something that I've started to do recently that I think is really important, is since they're brand new, they're already lubed up right, they got the oil on the bearings and the grease on the gears. The only thing that I'm doing today that's a little bit different than my pre-season prep in the past is I've had some issues with all different brands throughout the year as far as the these little nuts that hold the EVA foam grips on. Okay, those sometimes throughout the season, especially the end of the season, they'll start backing out, and then I'll have a tournament day where all of a sudden my little handle might fall off. Again, that's been an issue for forever, but I decided this year I'm going to just take some blue Loctite, and I'm going to go ahead and just take those little nuts off, put a little Loctite on there, and then tighten it back up, and that should eliminate any issue with any of those backing out. So that's just a little tip for you guys that are getting ready for the season. Might not be a bad thing to do, is just put one little drop will do of that stuff on there to keep those nuts. And every reel is going to be completely different. Some reels have certain screws that like to come loose. So if whatever reels you're using, just pay attention to which fasteners and nuts and all that stuff end up getting a little loose throughout the season, and then put a little bit of that blue Loctite on if you can. Really good stuff. You don't want to use the red. The red is permanent. And you definitely don't want to make a permanent adjustment on these things. But anyways, so that's what I've been doing with the new reels. The used reels, obviously, I'm going to be going through them, make sure they're all working tip-top performance, lubing them up, cleaning them first, lubing them after that, oil on the bearings, grease on the gears, that sort of thing. But anyways, today what I wanted to do was talk about gear ratio, because I think that is a topic that, even though I've done videos on gear ratio in the past, it's still a really good topic to revisit, even if I'm kind of repeating myself a little bit, because choosing the right gear ratio reel is super important. Gear ratio is essentially, the definition of it is how many turns, revolutions of the spool are made with one turn of the handle. So in this situation, what do we got here? A 6.5 to 1 gear ratio. That means that the spool is going to turn 6.5 times with one complete turn of the handle. So that's what it means. Now, a lot of people think that gear ratio is directly related to the speed at which you're bringing in your bait. There's a lot of different factors that kind of go into that, as far as how fast, how quickly you can bring in your line. For instance, if you have a reel that with the line on it, the spool is this big, but it's like a three gear ratio, like a big saltwater reel or something like that. Because you're wrapping the line onto a large spool, it's likely to reel in line faster than a much higher speed gear ratio of like a bass model reel. And that's just because you're wrapping around a larger spool in general. So the same thing applies on a smaller scale with bass reels. Like if you have a reel that maybe you don't have as much line on it as you should, and maybe you've just been clipping off line here and there. It's been a while, and you just have neglected to re-spool it. When you make a long cast with one of those reels that doesn't have enough line on it to begin with, even if it's a high-speed gear ratio reel, at the length of that cast, that spool is getting narrower. okay, because you have less line on it. And so you're not reeling in very quickly in that scenario, even if you have a burner reel. So it matters the diameter of the spool with and without the line. And there's a lot of different things that go into the speed at which you're bringing it back in. So just pay attention to that on top of the gear ratio. But to keep things simple, gear ratio is definitely the best, quickest way to understand, what reel you should choose out of, a variety of gear ratios. So the 3 different gear ratio ranges that are really popular today are the 6s, the 7s, and the 8s. So those are the 3 different categories that I have in my VLD 10s, and also in actually the FX8s only have 1 gear ratio, makes it easy, which they have the most versatile gear ratio, which in my opinion is like a 7.2 to 1, so the 7 range. But the VLD 10s, even in the left-handed versions, come in with a 6.5, a 7.2, and an 8.1 to 1 gear ratio, which covers all the bases that you could possibly face in bass fishing. And so let's go through each different gear ratio, starting with the lowest speed gear ratio. And one thing that I want to point out is one thing that people don't think about when it comes to gear ratio is really how much power it has. You think that the higher the gear ratio, the more power it has, the more torque it's offering. That's not true. In fact, the higher the gear ratio, the less power it has as far as cranking power. And that's why a higher speed gear ratio is going to be harder to reel like big deep diving crankbaits throughout the day, because it's wearing you out. Think of a bike. Think about the gear system on a bike. The lower the gear, the better you are at scaling hills and doing all that stuff. Things that are real high intensity. You want a lower gear for that. The higher gears are for when you're nice and flat and you're trying to get that extra speed, but you're not going up an incline or anything like that. So keep that in mind. Same overall theory applies to reels. So the 6.5 to 1 gear ratio that Fitzgerald has, and every company is going to be a little bit different. They're going to have different gear ratios, but we're talking about the 6 category, that 6 gear ratio category. Those reels are going to be for, number 1, like I said, my deep diving crankbaits, my crankbaits in general. I really like to use a reel in the 6 category. So 6.5 to 1 is the one I use in the VLD 10s. And the reason for that is just like I said, you have the extra power, so you're not fatiguing yourself throughout a day. And you can reel real fast. You can be all excitable and just be impatient and reel, and you're not going to overwork that bait. It's not going to start rolling on its side and acting funny in the water. As long as it's properly tuned, it's going to run right. And so 6.5 to 1 crankbaits, excluding lipless crankbaits. To me, lipless crankbaits I use with a higher speed gear ratio, the 7.2 to 1. So that's the exclusion. Crankbaits, some swim baits. So swim baits are another type of bait that you need to be very careful about how quickly you reel them in. Swim baits like, say, like a mag draft or something like that, that have those big paddle tails. If you reel them too fast, they tend to roll on their side and they might spin. So you don't want to reel them very fast. And so I'm an impatient type of guy. If I'm not really paying attention, oftentimes I'll start reeling a little bit too fast. So for those techniques that I really need to force myself to slow down with, I'll often go to a 6.5 to 1 gear ratio to keep the speed down, to slow myself down, to force that slow retrieve. Same thing with spinner baits. When I'm slow rolling spinner baits, I like to use the 6.5 to 1 gear ratio for that. But that pretty much is it. I don't use 6.5 for any bottom bouncing techniques. I don't use them for top waters. I don't use them for my chatterbaits, for shallow water spinner baits, any worm fishing, Carolina rig, jigs, anything like that. Not using a 6.5 to 1 gear ratio because I don't want a reel that is takes a little bit more time to reel something in. I want to be efficient with those baits because you don't need a slower gear ratio. All right, so let's move to the 7.2 to 1. This is the best range for most bass fishing techniques. So if you're buying one reel, I would definitely suggest that you buy a bait casting reel in that 7 category, that 7 range. So for the VLD10, it's a 7.2 to 1 gear ratio. So I've got a bunch of those because those are the most versatile of all the gear ratios out there. For 7.2 to 1, this is my favorite for fishing the lipless crankbait I was talking about, for fishing a spinnerbait up shallow if I'm not slow rolling it, chatterbaits, top waters, all kinds of different stuff. In fact, anything but deep diving crankbaits, and sometimes you can fish them, you can fish deep diving crankbaits on any gear ratio. It's just a matter of is the action being impeded, and also are you getting wore out? But the 7.2 to 1, I use it for all different kinds of stuff. I'll use it for worming, even though I like to use a higher speed gear ratio for worming because I can. I can reel it in real fast and make another presentation real fast. But the 7.2 to 1 does a really good job too. So 7.2 to 1 is your generalist. That is the best gear ratio for pretty much anything. Also, 7.2 to 1 is my choice for flipping heavy cover, okay? Because again, you got to be careful about using a really high speed gear ratio reel for flipping heavy cover because again, you're talking about a diminishing amount of torque as you go to those higher gear ratios. And so like punching mats or something like that, you do need some torque and some good torque, and you get that with the 7.2 to 1, but you also get the efficiency of a higher speed gear ratio. So 7.2 to 1 is my choice for flipping, pitching, punching, that sort of thing. If it's a little bit lighter cover and I'm just pitching to the edge of stuff, I'll probably maybe go up to a 8.1 to 1, but a 7 is really, really good overall for flipping and pitching. And then finally, the 8.1 to 1. When I'm using the 8.1 to 1, it's usually for something where I'm bottom bouncing baits, fishing a Carolina rig or a football jig or throwing a spoon or anything that doesn't require me to really manage the speed of my retrieve, but I'm essentially just picking up slack real quick. I'm going to be using an 8.1 to 1 reel. I also like it with jerk baits sometimes, and also when I'm frogging open water. Not when I'm fishing frogs over thick mats. I'll go back to the 7.2 to 1 for that because of the extra torque. But for open water where I'm just skipping it underneath trees real quick and making walking the dog a little bit and then reeling it back in real fast, the 8.1 to 1 keeps me extremely efficient. So any situation where you need to be very efficient and you're not relying on the reel to impart the action, you're essentially using the rod, so worming, spooning, things like that, 8.1 to 1 gear ratio does really, really well. But anyways, guys, those are just some of my thoughts on gear ratio. Those are the reels that I use and how I use them and what situations. And so let me know in the comments below, do you agree with where I use these different gear ratios and my overall assessment? And how do you like to use different gear ratios to your advantage with certain techniques? So drop a comment below. Thank you guys for watching. Make sure you like, share, subscribe. I'm going to see you out on the water. Oh, before we close this out, actually, remember that by using the links in the description, I'm going to put the links for each of these reels that I talked about in the description of this video. If you use it at 44tackle.com, you get 10% off of your order, and it kicks back a little bit to me to support the channel. So thank you guys very much, and I'm going to see you out on the water.